This is the story of Marcus Daniel Holt and his wife Lena Camille Holt. They met when both of them still had something to prove. Marcus was 29 and building a financial consulting firm from a leased office with second-hand chairs. Lena was 27, finishing her MBA and interviewing at firms that required her to wear heels she hadn't yet learned to walk in. What drew them together wasn't passion in its loudest form. It was recognition. They saw in each other the same particular hunger, the kind that doesn't announce itself but sits quietly behind the eyes. For 7 years they built a life around that shared understanding, and for a long time it was enough. What neither of them examined closely enough was what would happen when one of them stopped being hungry. Marcus made coffee the same way every morning, French press, 4 minutes steep, a splash of whole milk that Lena always forgot to put back in the right spot on the refrigerator shelf. He'd move it without comment. It was the kind of small, automatic adjustment that accumulates invisibly in long marriages. The things you correct so often that you stop noticing you're correcting them. Their house in the Avondale neighborhood was comfortable in the way that takes years and 2 incomes to achieve. Not ostentatious, but considered. There were bookshelves with books that had actually been read. A kitchen renovation they'd argued about for 3 months before agreeing on the marble countertops. A guest room that had gradually become Lena's home office, then gradually something else. A room full of shopping bags and unopened packages from brands Marcus didn't recognize. He worked long hours. He always had. Lena had too, until about 18 months ago, when she'd been passed over for a directorship at her firm, and something in her had quietly recalibrated. She hadn't quit then. That came later. But Marcus remembered the week it happened, the way she'd come home and said very little, eaten even less, and spent 3 evenings on the couch, watching a series about women in Monaco whose primary occupation appeared to be lunching. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Their friend Joel Marsh came over most Fridays. He was Marcus's oldest friend, a landscape architect who had married and divorced and was currently in a state he described as deliberately uncomplicated. Lena liked Joel in the easy way people like someone who asks questions, and then actually listens to the answers. Joel was one of the only people who could get Lena to talk about things she'd otherwise let pool silently beneath the surface. That particular Friday in March, Joel had brought wine and Lena had made pasta, the real kind, hand-rolled, which she only did when she was in a mood Marcus couldn't quite name. It looked like contentment. It felt like something being managed. "You seem relaxed," Joel said to her, twirling pasta onto his fork. "I am," Lena said. And then, after a pause that was almost too long, "I've been thinking about what I actually want." Marcus looked up from his plate. "From the pasta?" She smiled at him. It was a patient smile. "From things in general." Joel refilled his glass. "That's either the beginning of something good or the beginning of something complicated." "Maybe both," Lena said, and she said it lightly. "The way you say something when you've already decided." Marcus heard it. He heard it the way you hear a sound in the walls of an old house, present, noted, and then filed somewhere you don't immediately go back to. After Joel left, they stood together at the sink doing dishes. The window above the faucet was dark, and Marcus could see their partial reflections. Him taller, her leaning slightly into the counter, their movements coordinated in that unconscious marital rhythm that develops over years. "What did you mean earlier?" he asked. "About wanting things." Lena dried a bowl with slow, deliberate circles. "I just mean I'm tired," she said. "I've been tired for a while." "Tired of what?" She set the bowl down and turned to look at him with an expression he recognized but couldn't fully read. Something between affection and the very first note of distance. "Performing," she said. She went upstairs shortly after. Marcus stayed at the sink for a moment longer, the water still running. Staring at the place where her reflection had been, he turned the faucet off. He didn't ask what she meant by performing. He told himself it was because he didn't want to push. But somewhere, in the part of himself he kept well organized and rarely examined, he already understood that he hadn't asked because he wasn't entirely sure he wanted the answer. She resigned on a Tuesday in April. She told him over dinner, in the same measured tone she might use to mention a change in their grocery delivery schedule. "I put in my notice today," Lena said. Marcus was cutting a piece of chicken. He continued cutting it. For what reason? Because I don't want to go back. She said it plainly, without defense loaded into the words. I've been thinking about it for months. I want to take some time. Time, he repeated. Time, she said again, as though the repetition was confirmation rather than question. He set his fork down. He looked at her across the table, at her composed face, her straight posture, the small gold earrings she only wore on days she felt certain about something. How long have you been planning this? A while. You didn't bring it up. I'm bringing it up now. There was a silence between them that was not hostile, but was not comfortable either. It was the silence of two people who have learned to wait each other out and are not always sure whether that's patience or avoidance. We can talk about finances, Marcus said carefully, about what makes sense for us while you figure out the next thing. Lena picked up her wine glass. Sure, she said, we can do that. But she said it in a way that suggested the conversation, in her mind, was already finished. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed things he catalogued without quite confronting. Packages arriving daily. Skincare sets arranged on the bathroom counter like a small installation. New clothes with tags still on hanging in the closet with a kind of permanent temporariness. Lena began sleeping later, 9 o'clock becoming 10, 10 becoming 11 on the days when Marcus left early enough that no one was accounting for anyone. She had lunch with friends he vaguely knew, and dinner with people he was being introduced to for the first time. Women whose husbands or ex-husbands seemed to be the primary subject of their conversation. She was busy in the way people become busy when they've relieved themselves of obligation and replaced it with activity. Marcus, for his part, worked more. He told himself it was the quarter, that two of his larger clients were mid-restructure and needed careful attention. Both of these things were true. What was also true, though he did not articulate it even internally, was that the office had become the place where he felt least like someone waiting for something to arrive. One evening he came home to find Lena on a video call, laughing. Genuinely, openly laughing, in a way he couldn't remember hearing in the house in some months. She was on the couch with her feet tucked beneath her, wearing one of his old shirts, and the image was so familiar and so domestic that it stopped him briefly in the doorway. She saw him and waved without interrupting her laugh. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and stood there drinking it slowly. A friend of theirs, Dana Reeve, called him that week. Dana was Lena's closest friend from before the MBA. A woman Marcus respected for her directness and slightly distrusted for the same reason. She asked how things were going, and her voice had the careful quality of someone asking a question they already know the shape of the answer to. Things are fine, Marcus said. Said Dana. She seems happy, he offered. She seems comfortable, Dana said. There was a beat of silence. Those aren't always the same thing, Marcus. He didn't respond to that directly. After the call, he sat at his desk and looked at nothing for a moment. It was around this time that the conversation happened, the one that still comes back to him in pieces. They were in the car, returning from a dinner party, and Lena was talking about something she'd read about couples who designed their lives intentionally. Different models, she said, not the old assumptions. Marcus listened. He said, what does that look like, in practice, for you? I think, she started, and then paused. Then, in a slightly different register, the kind of voice a person uses when they've become briefly aware of something outside the room. I don't know, maybe like this story or subscribe or something. A beat. Marcus turned to look at her. She blinked, stared at the road ahead. Sorry, I don't know where that came from. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He turned back to the road too. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and something about that small strange moment, unexplained, unanswered, stayed with him longer than it had any right to. He found the documents in June, by accident. Not hidden documents. That was the part he kept returning to afterward. They were on the kitchen counter, under a canvas tote bag from a farmer's market she'd apparently been to without mentioning. A folder from a legal services firm with their address printed on it. Inside, a lease agreement. A lease in Lena's name for a space in the Whitmore building downtown, the kind of building where the elevators open directly into the suite. The monthly figure at the bottom of the page was more than they spent on their mortgage. He read it twice. Then he set it back under the tote bag and went upstairs and showered and got dressed and came back down and made coffee. He was still standing at the counter when Lena came down at 9:40, freshly showered herself, hair wrapped in a towel. "There's coffee," he said. "Thank you." She poured a cup. He waited until she was sitting at the kitchen island. Then he said, "What's the lease for?" She didn't flinch, which told him she'd anticipated this at some point, even if not today specifically. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "An office. You don't have a job." "Not yet." She looked at him with steady eyes. "I'm building something. I told you I wasn't just going to sit still. You told me you needed time. I need time and space." "Both." She paused. "I have a vision for a wellness consulting brand. I've been talking to some people. The space it's important for the brand positioning. You need people to take you seriously before you've done anything yet. That's just how it works now." Marcus set his mug down. He did it quietly. "You signed this before you talked to me about it. I was going to talk to you about it." "When?" She looked at her coffee. "Lena," he said. "When? When I had enough to show you." Her voice didn't rise, but there was an edge beneath it, something almost injured. "Because you always need something concrete. You don't invest in ideas. You invest in projections." He felt something move through him that he didn't immediately name. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of a room you've been in for a long time, suddenly looking different in new light. The proportions unchanged, but your understanding of them shifted. "How much have you committed?" he asked. She told him it was not just the lease. There were brand consultants, a design firm, a photographer whose contract included a non-refundable retainer. There was a line of credit she'd opened in her name. Small amounts individually, except that they weren't small when added. "I was going to bring it all to you as a complete picture," she said. "An ask. A proper ask." "An ask," he repeated. "Yes. For my income." She looked at him then, and for the first time, something wavered behind her composure. "For our income. We're married, Marcus." "I know we're married," he said. "I know exactly what that means." He didn't say anything else. He took his mug to the sink, rinsed it, and put it in the drying rack. Lena watched him do this. He picked up his keys. "I have calls this morning," he said. He left. He didn't yell. He hadn't wanted to. What surprised him on the drive to the office was that he didn't feel the urge. What he felt instead was a particular clarity, cool and almost administrative. He called his attorney from the car. He made an appointment for the following week. That afternoon, he began the process of separating their accounts. By September, Lena had a story. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was the version of events that she'd assembled from the parts she could live with. In this version, Marcus had always been controlling about money. He'd never truly believed in her ambitions. The separation of finances had been a power move, a way of pulling rank in a marriage that had always asked her to stay slightly smaller than she was. She'd been building something real, and he hadn't had the vision to see it. She told this version to Dana, to her mother, to two women from the wellness circle she'd started attending, who nodded with the fluency of people who told similar versions of their own stories. What she did not say aloud, the brand consultants had produced a deck that still lived in a folder on her desktop unopened. The photographer had delivered files she hadn't looked at in 6 weeks. The office space, which she'd imagined filling with clients and energy, and the particular pleasure of a life deliberately chosen, had become a place where she had long lunches alone with her laptop, researching things without quite doing them. She was not miserable. That was the complicated part. She existed in a state of suspended almost busy, almost fine, almost certain. She had moved into a furnished apartment in the Meridian, a building that cost more than it should have, using the line of credit she'd opened before Marcus's attorney had sent the first letter. She told herself this was temporary scaffolding. Marcus, in the same months, was learning what it felt like to come home to a house that was quiet in a different way than it had been when it was merely quiet. The early weeks were strange. He cooked, which he hadn't done much of before, and found he was either very good at it or very forgiving of himself. He had dinner with Joel twice and with Dana once, which surprised him, but Dana had called, and her voice again had its careful quality, and this time she'd said, "I want you to know I don't think this is simple," and he'd found that unexpectedly necessary to hear. He didn't date. He wasn't ready to date, and he knew it with the self-knowledge that had always been his most useful trait. He spent evenings working or reading or sitting in the backyard with a drink, watching the season change in the garden that Lena had planted 3 years ago and then gradually lost interest in. The roses had come back anyway. He found that interesting. In October, he got the call from Lena's attorney, a woman named Priscilla Hartwell, who spoke in the measured, unhurried cadence of someone practiced at delivering bad news neutrally. The lease on the Whitmore office space had gone to collections. The brand consultants were pursuing payment. The design firm had filed a small claims action. The photographer's retainer had been consumed by fees generated when the larger project stalled. The total was significant. Not catastrophic for Marcus, but significant. For Lena, without access to his income, and with the line of credit nearly exhausted, it was a different kind of number. "She's not looking to litigate," Priscilla Hartwell said. "She understands the situation she's in." Marcus said, "What does she want?" "Time, and a structured agreement. She's not asking you to absorb the debt. She's asking if there's a conversation to be had." He said he'd call back by end of week. He sat at his desk afterward for a long time, not working. He thought about Lena in the Whitmore office, imagining it full before it was. He thought about her hands around a coffee mug. He thought about the garden and the roses, and the particular silence of people who have decided things they haven't yet said. He didn't feel triumphant. He noticed this and found it important. They met at a coffee shop called Palmer's, midway between her apartment and the house that was still technically theirs. Neutral ground was what her attorney had suggested. Marcus had agreed without negotiating the location. He arrived first and chose a corner table. He ordered a coffee, black. He watched the door. When Lena came in, she looked, he noticed before he could stop himself, tired in a specific way. Not the performed exhaustion of overwork, but the real tiredness of people who have been working very hard to maintain a version of themselves that no longer quite fits. She was dressed carefully. Her hair was done, but there were shadows under her eyes that her concealer hadn't fully addressed. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She sat down and ordered tea from the server, and then they were alone with the ambient noise of the room around them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." She wrapped her hands around her tea mug. Not yet served, just something to do with her hands, and looked at the table between them. "I know Priscilla laid out the situation." She did. "I'm not here to ask you to fix it for me," Lena said. "I want you to know that." She looked up then. "I'm here because I wanted to. I didn't want it to be only attorneys. I didn't want the last real conversation we have to be through people we're paying." Marcus nodded, slowly. She exhaled. "I made assumptions," she said, "about what you would do, about what we were. I told myself I was building something, and I was. I think I was, in my own way, but I built the frame before I had walls, and I just kept." She trailed off. "I kept assuming the walls would come. Why didn't you talk to me?" She thought about this with visible effort. "Because I'd watched you look at things I brought you before. Ideas, half-formed things, and the way your face would." She stopped. "I thought if I waited until it was real, you'd receive it differently. But I waited until I needed you to fund it, which is not the same thing." The tea arrived. She thanked the server. They were quiet. "I did that," Marcus said eventually. "The face thing." He looked at the window. "I didn't know I was doing it." "I know. That's not." He paused. "It doesn't excuse what you did." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Outside the window, someone was trying to parallel park. They both watched this for a moment. The back and forth, the almost there. Marcus, she said, did you love me? I mean, toward the end. I'm not asking to, I'm just asking. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I did. She nodded once. Something crossed her face that she didn't try to contain or explain. I don't think I knew how to be loved by you, she said quietly, not without performing something in return. The words landed between them and stayed there. He thought about Fridays with Joel and Lena making pasta for reasons he'd only half understood. He thought about the ways she'd said performing, standing at the sink, and how he turned off the water and let the moment close. He thought about all the things that had been true at the same time, in the same house, between two people who'd recognized each other once, and then, somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of years, had stopped looking. I'll talk to my attorney, he said. We'll figure out something reasonable. She looked at him sharply, not with suspicion, but with something more fragile than that. You don't have to. I know. She nodded again, smaller this time. They finished their drinks. When the check came, they reached for it at the same moment and then both withdrew at the same moment, which was so precisely them, who they had been, the exact nature of what they'd lost, that neither of them could speak for a second. Marcus picked up the check. Outside, the air was cool and the street was ordinary and unhelpful. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk without quite parting. I hope it becomes something, he said. What you're building. She looked at him with eyes that were very clear. I hope you let someone see you, she said. Not just the finished product. He didn't have an answer for that. She walked to her car. He stood a moment longer, watching without meaning to, and then he turned and walked in the other direction. He thought about the roses. He thought about the coffee, French press, 4 minutes steep. He thought about everything that accumulates invisibly in a life. All the small automatic adjustments, all the things you correct so often you stop noticing you're correcting them. And then he thought briefly of the things you don't correct. The things you file away and don't return to until the house is quiet and the garden is growing without you. And you are standing in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, understanding at last what you chose not to see. He walked to his car. He drove home alone. The roses bloomed again in spring. No one planted them. They simply returned, the way some things do, without permission, without explanation, into the space that grief and time and weather had made for them.